I have to tell you, some moments just stay with you. You know those tiny, quiet decisions that feel like nothing at the time? The ones where you think nobody is watching? Well, it turns out the world is listening much closer than we think. This is about a boy named Elias, a single meal, and a knock on a door that changed everything. The plastic bag felt heavy in Elias's hand, the steam from the takeout containers warming his palm through the thin material. It was Friday night. In his neighborhood, Friday night meant the one luxury he allowed himself: the number 7 from the corner grill. Extra fries, extra seasoning. He'd worked 10 hours at the garage, his fingernails still stained with grease that soap couldn't touch, and his stomach was a hollow, aching pit. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jittery shadows on the pavement. He was just 2 blocks from his apartment, 2 blocks from his couch, and the first full meal he'd had in 24 hours. But then he saw them. Sitting on a bus stop bench that had seen better decades were 2 people who looked like they'd been forgotten by time itself. An elderly man and woman huddled together. It wasn't just that they looked cold, it was the way the man was rubbing his wife's hands, trying to give her heat he clearly didn't have himself. Elias slowed down. He didn't want to stop. He was hungry, really, truly hungry. He thought about the rent he had to pay on Monday and how this meal was his one reward. But he looked at the woman's face. She reminded him of his grandmother, that same quiet, dignified endurance in the eyes. He saw the man whisper something to her, and she just shook her head, pulling her thin coat tighter. There was a silence between them that felt like a shared secret of loss. Elias felt a sudden, sharp pang in his chest that had nothing to do with hunger. He looked at his bag, then at them. He hesitated for a heartbeat. The wind whistling through the alleyway, carrying the scent of rain and old exhaust. He walked over. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a bit raspy. The man looked up, eyes guarded, ready for trouble. Elias didn't give him a chance to be afraid. He just held out the bag. I accidentally ordered 2. I can't finish it. Please. It's still hot." The man looked at the bag, then at Elias's grease-stained hands. He knew Elias was lying. You can tell when someone has extra and when someone is giving away their only. The man's bottom lip trembled, just a fraction. "Son," he whispered, "we can't take your dinner." Elias forced a smile, though his stomach let out a treacherous growl. "It's not my dinner, sir. It's extra. Please. My grandma would kill me if I let good food go to waste." The woman reached out then, her fingers touching Elias's sleeve. They were ice cold. "Thank you," she breathed. The man took the bag, his hands shaking, and the smell of the fries filled the air. Elias didn't stay to watch them eat. He didn't want to make them feel like a charity case. He just nodded, turned around, and walked back into the dark, his stomach screaming at him, his pockets empty, but his heart feeling a strange, heavy warmth that he couldn't quite explain. He went home, drank a large glass of water, and fell asleep to the sound of the radiator clicking in the corner. The next morning, the sun didn't so much rise as it did bruise the sky, a dull, heavy purple that eventually faded into a cold, clinical gray. Elias woke up before his alarm, his body still feeling the physical weight of yesterday's shift at the shop. He lay there for a second, staring at a crack in the ceiling that looked vaguely like a map of a place he'd never go. His stomach felt flat and hollow, a reminder of the dinner he'd given away, but strangely, the sharp edge of the hunger was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet sort of stillness. He thought about that old couple. He wondered if they'd found a warm place to sleep, or if that meal was already a distant memory to them, burned up by the cold of the night. He rolled out of bed, his joints popping, and reached for the same pair of jeans he'd worn for 3 days. He was in the middle of splashing cold water on his face when it happened, a sound that didn't belong in his Saturday morning. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't the frantic pounding of the landlord looking for back rent, and it wasn't the rhythmic tapping of his neighbor Marcus wanting to borrow a cigarette. This was a solid, deliberate sound, a sound that carried authority. Elias froze, the water dripping from his chin onto the linoleum floor. He wasn't used to visitors. In this neighborhood, an unexpected knock usually meant someone was looking for trouble, or trouble had finally found you. He wiped his face with a threadbare towel, his heart starting to do a slow, heavy thud against his ribs. He walked to the door, checking the deadbolt, his hand hovering over the handle. He hesitated. He almost didn't open it. When he finally pulled the door back, he didn't see a debt collector or a cop. Standing in the dim hallway was a man who looked like he belonged in a skyscraper downtown, not a crumbling apartment complex on the edge of the city. He was tall, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Elias made in a year, a deep navy wool that looked soft enough to sink into, but it was his face that stopped Elias. He didn't look like a predator. He looked searched. His eyes were scanning Elias's face with an intensity that made Elias feel like he was being read like a book. Behind him, the hallway smelled like the usual mix of damp carpet and stale cooking. But this man brought with him the scent of expensive cedar and something clean, like the air after a storm. "Can I help you?" Elias asked, his voice sounding smaller than he wanted. It too. He subconsciously tucked his stained hands into his pockets, feeling the familiar shame of the grease he could never quite scrub away. The stranger didn't speak immediately. He just looked at Elias, his expression unreadable, a slight frown creasing his forehead. The silence stretched out, becoming heavy and awkward, the kind of silence that makes you want to look at your shoes. Elias felt a bead of sweat roll down his back despite the chill in the air. He was about to close the door, thinking it was some kind of mistake, when the man finally moved. He reached into his inner pocket, and Elias flinched, just a little, a reflex born of living in a place where people reach for things you don't want to see. But the man didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a small, crumpled napkins, the cheap white kind they give you at the corner grill. The man held it out. On it, in shaky, elegant cursive that looked like it had been written by a hand that hadn't held a pen in years, were 3 words: "He saved us." Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He recognized that napkin. It was from his bag. He looked from the paper to the man, his mouth dry. I don't understand," Elias whispered, though a part of him was starting to. The stranger took a step forward, not aggressively, but with a sudden, desperate kind of grace. "My parents," the man said, and his voice cracked, "just once. They have Alzheimer's. They wandered away from their assisted living home yesterday afternoon. W.E. had the police, the trackers, everyone out looking for them in the cold. We thought we'd lost them." He stopped, taking a jagged breath. "They were found this morning sitting on a park bench. They were warm, they were fed, and my mother, she wouldn't stop clutching this napkin." Elias leaned against the doorframe, the world tilting just a little. He remembered the way the woman's fingers had felt on his arm. Ice cold. He remembered the man's shaking hands. He hadn't known they were lost, he just thought they were poor. He hadn't known he was feeding someone's mother and father, he just thought he was feeding 2 people who were hungry. The stranger looked around the hallway, at the peeling wallpaper, the flickering light bulb, the general coat of exhaustion that covered everything in Elias's life. "My name is Julian Thorne," the man said, extending a hand. Elias took it automatically. The man's grip was firm, but he didn't let go. "You gave them your last meal, didn't you? I saw the security footage from the shop across the street. You looked in that bag 3 times before you gave it to them. You were starving." Elias felt his face flush. "I was fine," he mumbled. "It was just a burger." Julian shook his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It wasn't just a burger, Elias. It was a choice. And now I'm here to make one of my own." Julian didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the apartment, his presence making the small, cramped room feel even smaller. He looked at the single chair, the stack of library books on the floor, and the window that rattled every time a truck passed by. He didn't look with judgment. It was more like he was seeing a puzzle he was determined to solve. Elias just stood there by the door, his hand still on the knob, feeling like a ghost in his own home. He felt a sudden, sharp urge to explain himself, to say he was going to fix the place up, that he was studying for his certifications, that he wasn't just this. But the words stayed stuck in his throat. "My father was a carpenter," Julian said suddenly, turning away from the window. He was looking at a small wooden bird Elias had carved and left on the radiator. It was rough, but it had life in it. He used to say that you can tell everything about a man's soul by how he treats people who can do absolutely nothing for him. He's not really there anymore. The disease, it takes the memories first, then the personality. But this morning, when he was eating the leftovers of that meal you gave him, he looked at me and said, 'A king fed us tonight.'" Julian's voice dropped to a whisper. "He hasn't called me by my name in 3 years, Elias, but he remembered the kindness of a stranger." Elias felt a lump form in his throat, thick and painful. He thought about his own father, who had worked himself into an early grave at the docks, always telling Elias that the world doesn't give prizes for being nice, son. It gives prizes for being fast. He'd spent his whole life trying to be fast, trying to keep up, trying to survive. Being nice was a luxury he didn't think he could afford. I didn't want them to be cold, Elias said, his voice cracking. It wasn't a big deal. I'm okay. I don't need a reward for being human. He felt defensive, almost angry. He didn't want to be a charity case for this billionaire. Julian walked over to him, stopping just a few inches away. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. He didn't hand it over immediately. This isn't a reward, Elias. A reward is for a job done. This is an investment in a heart that the world hasn't managed to break yet. He placed the envelope on the small kitchen table next to a half-empty box of cereal. I own a logistics and engineering firm. We're opening a new vocational center, a place for people who have the talent, but not the papers. I want you to head the mechanical division, but first, I want you to go to that address inside. It's a house. It's empty. It's yours. Elias laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. You're crazy. You don't even know me. I could be anyone. Julian just looked at him, his gaze steady and unnervingly calm. I know you're the man who gave his only meal to two strangers in the dark. That's all I need to know. The house belonged to my parents. They can't live there anymore. They need specialized care now. I was going to sell it, but this morning, after I saw that napkin, I realized it needed someone who understands what a home is actually worth. Julian turned to leave, pausing at the door. Most people look at the world and ask, what can I get? You looked at the world and asked, what can I give? I'm just evening the scales, Elias. As the door clicked shut, the silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. Elias stared at the envelope. His hands were shaking so hard he had to sit down. He thought about the grease under his fingernails, the unpaid electric bill tucked under the fruit bowl, and the way his stomach had felt last night. He reached out, his fingers brushing the heavy paper. Outside, the rain finally started to fall, a soft pitter-patter against the glass, sounding like 1,000 tiny heartbeats. He realized he was crying, not because he was sad, but because for the first time in 22 years, he felt like he could finally stop running. He felt like he could breathe. The envelope felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Elias sat there at his small, scarred kitchen table, the wood grain worn smooth by years of other people's lives before he'd ever moved in. He didn't open it right away. He couldn't. He just watched the rain streaks on the window, thinking about how yesterday he was worried about the price of a bus pass. And today, a man in a navy coat had talked to him about houses and investments. It felt like a fever dream. It felt like the kind of story that happens to other people, the people in the movies with swelling music and the perfect lighting. Not the boy from the east side who still had a scar on his knuckle from a slipped wrench 2 weeks ago. When he finally slid his thumb under the flap, the paper was thick and gave way with a satisfying, expensive-sounding tear. Inside was a set of keys, heavy, brass, and cold, attached to a leather ring. There was also a deed, a folded map, and a handwritten note. His eyes blurred as he tried to read the text. The garden needs work, and the porch light flickers in the wind, but the bones are good. Make it a home again. Elias gripped the keys so tight the metal bit into his palm. He needed to feel that pain. He needed to know he wasn't asleep in his narrow bed, dreaming of a life he couldn't have. He didn't take the bus. He couldn't sit still long enough for the stops. He walked. He walked for nearly an hour, leaving the gray, cramped blocks behind, watching the buildings grow taller and then shorter again until the air started to smell different, less like exhaust and more like wet earth and pine needles. He found the address on a quiet, winding street where the trees arched over the road like a canopy. It was a small house, painted a soft, faded yellow with white trim. It wasn't a mansion, but to Elias, it looked like a cathedral. It had a front porch with a swing that swayed gently in the breeze, creaking a rhythmic, lonely tune. He stood at the gate for a long time. His boots were caked with mud from the walk, and he felt out of place, like a smudge of grease on a clean sheet. He thought about turning back. He thought about how he didn't belong here, among the manicured lawns and the silence. But then he remembered the old woman's hand on his arm. He remembered her husband calling him a king. He realized that kindness wasn't a transaction, it was a bridge. He walked up the path, his heart hammering against his ribs, and put the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, oiled click. The air inside smelled of beeswax and old books. It was warm, despite the heat being turned low. He walked through the living room, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. There were ghosts of memories everywhere, faint outlines on the walls where pictures used to hang, a scratch on the floorboards where a chair had been pulled out 1,000 times for dinner. He reached the kitchen and stopped. On the counter was a basket of groceries, fresh bread, fruit, milk, and a box of that same No. 7 seasoning from the corner grill. Next to it was a small, framed photo of the elderly couple, smiling in the sun, looking healthy and whole. Elias sank onto the floor, put his head in his hands, and finally let the tears come. He wasn't just a boy with grease-stained hands anymore. He was home. Monday morning didn't feel like a Monday. Usually that meant the jarring scream of a phone alarm at 5 a.m., the smell of burnt coffee in the hallway, and the long, cold trek to the garage where the air was always thick with the scent of old oil and disappointment. But this morning, Elias woke up to the sound of a bird, a real singing bird, perched on the branch of an oak tree just outside his window. The light in this new room was different. It was soft, filtered through clean glass, hitting the hardwood floors in long, golden slats. He lay there for a moment, his breath hitching in his chest, terrified that if he moved too quickly, the walls would dissolve back into the peeling wallpaper of his old apartment. He dressed slowly. He didn't have a suit, and he didn't have anything that looked like management, but he'd spent 2 hours the night before scrubbing his hands with a stiff brush and lemon juice until the skin was raw, finally chasing the last of the engine grease from under his nails. He put on his best button-down shirt, the one he usually only wore to church or funerals, and tucked the brass keys into his pocket. He looked at himself in the hallway mirror. He looked like the same Elias, but his shoulders were straighter. The weight he'd been carrying for years, that constant low-level hum of survival anxiety, had finally gone quiet. The logistics firm was a massive glass and steel structure that seemed to touch the clouds. Stepping into the lobby, Elias felt that old familiar surge of "I don't belong here" rising in his throat. People moved with purpose, clutching tablets and espresso cups, their shoes clicking sharply on the marble. He felt like a stray dog that had wandered into a gala. He approached the desk, his voice sticking. I'm Elias Thorne. I mean, Elias, just Elias. I'm here to see Julian." The receptionist didn't look at his worn boots. She just smiled, a genuine warm expression. "Mr. Thorne is expecting you, Elias. Head straight to the top floor." When the elevator doors opened, Julian was standing there, looking out over the city. He wasn't wearing the navy coat today, just a simple sweater, looking more like a man and less like a myth. He turned and walked straight over, clapping a hand on Elias's shoulder. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink," Julian noted, his eyes crinkling. Elias managed a shaky laugh. "I kept checking the locks, making sure the house was still there." Julian nodded, his expression turning serious. "The house is yours, Elias, but this," he gestured to the sprawling office and the blueprints spread across a massive table. "This is where you earn the future. We start today." They spent the afternoon in the warehouse section of the facility. It was a mechanic's dream. Pristine tools, hydraulic lifts that didn't groan, and engines that looked like pieces of art. Julian explained the goal, a program to train young people from Elias's old neighborhood, giving them the technical skills to maintain the firm's new fleet of electric transport. "I know engines, Julian," Elias said, running a hand over a gleaming diagnostic machine. "But I don't know how to teach. I don't know how to lead." Julian stopped and looked him dead in the eye. "You taught me more about humanity in 30 seconds at a bus stop than I learned in 4 years of business school. You lead by being the man who gives when he has nothing. The rest? The rest is just technicalities. We'll learn that together." As the sun began to set, casting a deep orange glow through the warehouse windows, Elias felt a strange sensation. It was a sense of purpose that went beyond just making enough money to eat. He looked at his hands. They were clean, but he knew they wouldn't stay that way for long. He was going to get them dirty again, but this time it would be to build something, not just to patch up the broken pieces of a life he was trying to escape. He thought about the kids on his old block, the ones who thought the world ended at the corner of 5th and Main. He realized he wasn't just given a house, he was given a chance to be the knock on the door for someone else. Success has a funny way of making you feel like an imposter, and for Elias, the next 6 months were a blur of high stakes, learning, and deep, quiet reflection. He was no longer just the boy from the garage, he was the director of the Thorn Vocational Initiative. He had an office with a view, a paycheck that didn't disappear the moment it touched his bank account, and a nameplate that felt like a lie every time he looked at it. But his heart stayed in the grease. Every morning, before the instructors arrived, Elias would go down to the workshop floor. He'd pick up a wren, feel the cold weight of it, and breathe in the scent of metal and ozone. It grounded him. It reminded him that, while his life had changed, the man inside the skin was the same one who had sat on a crate in the rain, sharing a single sandwich with a stray dog because he couldn't bear to eat alone. One Tuesday, a group of new recruits arrived. They were kids from the east side, tough, guarded, and wearing the same mask of indifference Elias had worn for 2 decades. Among them was a boy named Kyle. He couldn't have been more than 19, with a sharp jawline and eyes that looked like they'd seen things eyes that young shouldn't see. He stood in the back of the group, arms crossed, his hood pulled low. During the orientation, while Elias spoke about torque and electrical currents, Kyle let out a soft, cynical snort. "Why you doing this?" the boy interrupted, his voice cutting through the professional hum of the room. "Rich guys don't just give away jobs. What's the catch? You looking for some cheap labor to make your boss look good on the news?" The room went silent. The other instructors shifted uncomfortably, but Elias didn't flinch. He looked at Kyle and saw a mirror. He saw the anger that comes from being told you're nothing until you start to believe it. Elias stepped down from the podium and walked over to the boy. He didn't pull rank. He didn't get angry. Instead, he held out his hands. The palms still bore the faint, permanent shadows of his years under car chassis, despite the expensive soap he used now. "There's no catch, Kyle," Elias said softly. "The man who owns this building didn't hire me because I had a degree. He hired me because I gave a burger to a couple on a bus stop." He saw Kyle's brow furrow in confusion. "The world is a hard place, and it wants you to be hard too. But the moment you stop caring about the person standing next to you is the moment you actually lose. This isn't charity. This is a chance to prove the world wrong about us." That evening, after the recruits had gone, Elias stayed late. He found himself driving back to his old neighborhood, something he rarely did. The streets looked smaller, narrower, more tired. He parked a block away from the corner grill and just sat in his car, watching the neon sign flicker. He saw a young man walk out with a bag of food, the steam rising into the cold night air, just like his had months ago. He realized that Julian hadn't just saved him from poverty, he'd saved him from the bitterness that poverty breeds. He reached into his glove box and pulled out a small, laminated copy of the napkin Julian had shown him. "He saved us." He looked at the words until they blurred. He realized then that the elderly couple hadn't just been a test, they were a gift. They were the bridge between the boy he was and the man he was becoming. He drove back to his yellow house, the one with the porch swing that still creaked in the wind. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw a figure sitting on the steps. It was Julian. He looked tired, his expensive suit jacket draped over his arm, his tie loosened. Elias got out of the car, a sense of worry blooming in his chest. "Julian? Is everything okay?" Julian looked up, and for the first time Elias saw a profound sadness in the man's eyes. "My father passed away an hour ago, Elias," Julian said, his voice a dry whisper, but right before he went, he was lucid. "Just for a minute. He asked me if the king was doing well. He wanted to make sure you were still building things." Elias sat down on the step next to the man who had changed his life. They sat in the silence of the suburban night, two men from different worlds, united by a single act of kindness and a father's final flickering memory. The funeral for Julian's father was a quiet, dignified affair, the kind of event where the silence says more than the eulogies. Elias stood in the back wearing a black suit that Julian had insisted on buying for him. He felt like a shadow among the giants of industry and old money, but as Julian stood at the pulpit, his eyes found Elias in the crowd and stayed there for a long, meaningful second. It was a silent acknowledgement. "We are here because of you." After the service, the air felt heavy with the scent of lilies and damp earth. Elias walked through the cemetery, his shoes sinking slightly into the manicured grass, until he found the spot where the old man had been laid to rest. He stood there for a long time, thinking about how a man he barely knew, a man who had been lost in the fog of his own mind, had fundamentally redirected the course of a stranger's life. A few weeks later, Elias walked into Julian's office. He didn't come with reports or budget requests. He came with a vision. "I want to expand the initiative," Elias said, his voice steady, grounded in a new kind of confidence. "I want to create a housing program for the students. Not just a place to sleep, but a place to belong. We can't expect these kids to build a future when they're still sleeping in the middle of a war zone every night." Julian looked up from his desk, a tired but proud smile touching his lips. "It's a massive undertaking, Elias. The board will fight the costs. They see employees, they don't see people." Elias leaned forward, placing his hands on the mahogany desk. "Then let them talk to me. Let them see what happens when you treat someone like they matter before they have anything to offer." Elias began spending his weekends back in the old neighborhood, but not as a ghost. He went to the community centers, the high schools, and the street corners. He talked to the mothers who were tired of crying and the fathers who had given up. He told them his story. Not the version where a billionaire makes everything perfect, but the version where a hungry boy chose to be kind when it hurt. He became a fixture in the places people usually tried to forget. He found Kyle, the skeptical recruit, working on a broken-down bike in an alleyway. Elias didn't offer him a lecture. He just sat down in the dirt, picked up a wrench, and started helping. "You have the hands of a master technician, Kyle," Elias said as they worked. "Don't let the world turn them into fists." The transformation wasn't just in Elias's bank account. It was in the way he moved through the world. He started a Friday table at the vocational center. Every Friday night he would order a massive spread from the corner grill where he used to buy his number 7. He made sure there was enough for every student, every janitor, and every security guard. They would sit together, the smell of seasoned fries filling the high-tech lab, and for an hour there were no bosses or subordinates. There were just people sharing a meal. It was a ritual of remembrance. He wanted them to feel the warmth he had felt when he saw that elderly couple finally eating. He wanted them to know that no matter how high they climbed, the grow und was always where the heart lived. One evening, as Elias was locking up the workshop, he saw a woman standing by the gate. She was elderly, wearing a coat that looked familiar. It was the woman from the bus stop. She looked different now, cleaner, rested, but her eyes were still the same windows to a long lived-in soul. Elias felt his breath catch. He walked over, his heart doing that familiar thud. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" She smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through a cloud. "Julian told me I could find you here. I wanted to give you something." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small hand-knitted scarf. It was a deep, earthy green. "I made this for you. My husband—" He passed peacefully, Elias. "And he wanted you to know that that night on the bench, it wasn't the food that saved us. It was the fact that someone saw us. We weren't invisible anymore." 10 years later, the yellow house on the hill was no longer quiet. It was filled with the sounds of a life fully lived. The rhythmic creak of the porch swing, the sizzle of garlic in a heavy iron skillet, and the high-pitched laughter of a young girl named Maya, who had her father's inquisitive eyes. Elias stood in the kitchen, his hair now flecked with a bit of premature gray at the temples, looking out the window at the garden he had spent a decade nurturing. The roses were in full bloom, their deep red petals heavy with the morning dew. He looked at his hands. They were scarred and calloused, a map of 1,000 engines repaired and 1,000 lives touched, but they were clean. He was preparing for the 10th anniversary of the Thorn Elias Foundation. What had started as a small vocational workshop had grown into a nationwide network of schools, housing, and community centers. But for Elias, the numbers didn't matter. What mattered were the faces. He thought of Kyle, who was now a lead engineer at a renewable energy firm in the city, and how Kyle still called him every Friday night just to check in. He thought of the hundreds of kids who had walked through those glass doors with their hoods pulled low and their hearts locked tight, only to walk out as men and women who knew their own worth. He realized that the number 7 meal he had given away so long ago hadn't just fed 2 people, it had seeded a forest. A car pulled into the driveway, and Julian stepped out. He looked older now, the sharp edges of his corporate ambition softened by years of philanthropy and a deep, abiding friendship with the man he had once plucked from a dark hallway. Julian didn't head for the front door. He walked straight to the garden where Elias was standing. They didn't need many words. They stood in the silence of the morning, watching the sun climb higher into the sky. "I saw the news this morning," Julian said softly. They're calling you the mechanic of the soul. How does that feel? Elias laughed, a deep, honest sound. It feels like I'm still just a guy who was really hungry one. Friday night, Julian. I'm just glad I didn't eat that burger. They walked inside, where Elias's wife was setting the table. On the wall, in a simple wooden frame, hung that original crumpled napkin. It was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, but the words were as sharp as a heartbeat. He saved us. It was the most valuable thing in the house. More than the deed, more than the awards, more than the legacy. It was a reminder that the smallest act of grace is a stone thrown into a pond. The ripples never truly stop. Elias sat down at the head of his table, surrounded by his family and his best friend, and he felt a profound sense of peace. He knew that the world was still a hard place, and that there would always be people sitting on cold benches in the dark. But he also knew that as long as there was one person willing to share what they had, the dark would never win. As the sun hit its peak, there was a knock on the front door. Elias stood up, a smile spreading across his face. He didn't hesitate this time. He didn't look for trouble. He opened the door to find a young man standing there, looking nervous, holding a folder of sketches and a heart full of hope. The boy looked exactly like Elias had a lifetime ago, grease under his nails, a flicker of defiance in his eyes, and a hunger for something more than just food. Elias stepped back and swung the door wide, his voice warm and welcoming. "Come in," he said. "We've been expecting you. Tell me your story." And as the boy stepped over the threshold, Elias knew the cycle was starting all over again, a never-ending chain of kindness that began with a single meal and ended in a life changed forever.